For 3 decades, Johnny Carson was the king of late-night comedy. Throughout the beloved host's time on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, you might have assumed that Johnny and frequent guest Bob Hope were good friends due to the number of appearances the legendary comedian made on the program. But it now appears as if this could not have been further from the truth. Join Facts First as we explore why Johnny Carson hated this Tonight Show guest more than anyone. Johnny Carson was host of The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, for 3 decades, from 1962 to 92. Over that time, he had a wide variety of guests. Many who appeared on the program were burgeoning comedians who received their first mainstream fame thanks to performances on the show. Some of the most notable figures who caught their big breaks thanks to Johnny Carson include Jerry Seinfeld and Joan Rivers. And Carson often featured A-list stars like Frank Sinatra and Bob Hope. Throughout Carson's time at NBC, the host grew to be one of the most bankable stars at the network. But he never quite grew to surpass legendary comedian Bob Hope in stature. Bob was always one step ahead of Johnny at the NBC offices, having previously occupied the stage Johnny used for his time on The Tonight Show. According to legend, Bob could essentially book himself on The Tonight Show whenever he wanted. Bob would often request an appearance on the show when he had a new special to promote. When Bob asked for the opportunity, Johnny understandably accepted. But it now appears as if Johnny never enjoyed having him on. Sadly, it appears as if the on-screen relationship between Johnny Carson and Bob Hope was completely fake. Johnny actually despised the comedian and only allowed him on the show so often because he felt he had no other option. There were numerous reasons Johnny disliked Bob Hope, and he grew to dislike him even more as the years went on. By the time Johnny had finished his tenure on The Tonight Show in 1992, he had arguably grown to dislike comedian Bob Hope more than any other guest. One of the biggest reasons Johnny couldn't stand Bob was that Bob was completely incapable of improvisation. Johnny was quick on his feet and liked to have spontaneous banter with his guests. Given that Bob was a legendary comedian, one might have assumed the celebrity figure would have had some wit of his own. But it appears this wasn't the case. Even at Bob's physical peak, it appears he had to rely on his team of comedy writers to come up with anything funny to say. In his later years, his reliance on his writers grew to the point where he had to rely on them to even understand what was going on. Unlike Johnny Carson, who retired as soon as his health started failing, Bob pushed beyond his years and continued performing when he barely could. Due to Bob's lack of improvisational skills, Johnny grew to consider the legendary comedian to be a bad guest. But he continued having him on because he felt he couldn't turn him down. Johnny grew incredibly bored of the comedian's scripted routines and resented the fact that Bob's stature at NBC made it so he had no ability to deny his requests to appear. Often Bob Hope's appearances on The Tonight Show would be staged to appear spontaneous. But according to Johnny, there wasn't a single thing about the comedian that was actually spontaneous. These fake surprise appearances would typically result in Bob rattling off a few scripted jokes and making way for a reel of footage from an upcoming special. According to Johnny Carson, these reels would often be poorly cut and much longer than Bob had initially promised. This was another thing about Bob that rubbed Johnny the wrong way. One time, Bob was a guest on the show and noticed the audience was laughing exceptionally loud at the host's monologue. This led Bob to ask Johnny if he could use some recordings of the laughter as the canned laughter on his upcoming special. Johnny agreed, but was once again taken aback by Bob's forwardness. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to Facts First for more, and stick around for more about Johnny and Bob. Bob Hope's appearances on The Tonight Show were irritating for Johnny Carson at the best of times, but they became even more annoying for the host once the legendary comedian's health began failing. If Bob had a hard time improvising at peak health, the act proved completely impossible during his later years. According to Johnny, Bob would have no idea what he was talking about unless the host stayed completely on script. If Johnny read the wrong question from his card, Bob was liable to give the answer to a completely different question. Seeing Bob in this state was one of the reasons Johnny chose to retire before his own health began failing. According to legend, Johnny turned to his crew after one of Bob's later performances and told them to shoot him if he ever ended up like that. Bob Hope was certainly one of the most frequent guests The Tonight Show ever had, but he's not the only frequent guest who rubbed the host the wrong way. Another frequent guest was Joan Rivers. Johnny and Joan memorably developed a feud over the decades of Johnny's tenure. Joan had gotten her big break performing on the show with Johnny as a host, and their chemistry had been a big hit. After Joan's initial appearance on the show, its host memorably made the comment he thought Joan Rivers was going to become a star. Joan certainly did, and continued appearing on the show for many years. It got to the point where Joan was called in whenever NBC needed someone to replace Johnny Carson, whether he was on vacation or just not feeling well. So you might assume Joan was actually close friends with Johnny. Sadly, it appears Johnny and Joan's on-screen chemistry was once again a facade for the cameras. Johnny treated Joan like a business asset, and the two never developed a true friendship when the cameras weren't rolling. When Joan Rivers was given an opportunity to host her own show in the 80s, Johnny went to war with the comedian. According to the late Joan Rivers, the reason Johnny was so mad was that she was a woman. Johnny put out the word that anyone who appeared as a guest on Joan's show wouldn't be allowed on his. Because of this, Joan's show ended up failing very early on. Though she found later success as a daytime talk show host, she never again returned to hosting late-night television. In fact, she couldn't return to The Tonight Show until shortly before her death, when Jimmy Fallon had taken over. Jay Leno had been Johnny's replacement, and he refused to let Joan on during his time out of respect for Johnny. While feuds are typical in Hollywood, the stars involved in them will often let them go as they're lying on their deathbeds. But this wasn't the case for either Johnny or Joan. Johnny went first, and he and Joan never patched things up. In Joan's last years after his death, she never changed her tune and continued saying disparaging things about the late talk show host. According to Joan, Johnny had been her professional mentor, and he had acted very unprofessionally when he started the ridiculous feud. On the other side of the coin, Don Rickles was a frequent guest who managed to stay on the beloved host's good side. Like Bob Hope, Don was a legendary comedian who often appeared on The Tonight Show, but the visits were always met with a warm reception by Johnny Carson. Not only did Johnny find Don Rickles authentically funny, but he also had no problem improvising with the comedian and developing interesting comedic banter. Now it's time to hear from you. Did you know Johnny couldn't stand having Bob Hope as a guest? Let us know in the comments section below. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to FactsVerse if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.